Hey agents, if you're new to Escalations and have hit a massive wall of difficulty at certain tiers, you're definitely not alone. One of the things I've noticed while climbing from the lower tiers into higher ones is that many of the habits, assumptions, and even builds that work perfectly well elsewhere don't always translate into success here. The reason for that is simple. Enemies aren't just tougher, tankier, and capable of dealing more damage. They operate differently, gain entirely new capabilities, and force your team to adapt in ways that most other game modes never demanded. Those new mechanics are called mutators. What surprised me most wasn't simply how difficult escalations could become. It was how quickly a single mistake could snowball into disaster. One player goes down, someone breaks formation trying to get a revive. A mutator triggers. The team loses control of the fight, and before you know it, everyone is standing back at the mission entrance, wondering who still has tokens left. I want you to take a look at this chart. This data, courtesy of Reddit user Dognuts, shows how enemy scaling increases as you climb through the escalation tiers. And I added the graph on the right because I really want you to visualize what's happening here, rather than simply look at a table of numbers. As you move up the tiers, the scaling doesn't just increase, it accelerates. Tier 0 is considered heroic difficulty. By Tier 10, enemy damage has increased to 550% of normal values, while enemy health and armor have reached a staggering 800%. Think about that for a moment. These aren't simply tougher heroic enemies, they're operating on an entirely different scale. And as intimidating as that already sounds, this is only the beginning. Because all of this enemy scaling exists before mutators start changing the rules of the fight. They introduce new enemy behaviors, new threats, and new mechanics that force players to rethink positioning, teamwork, tactics, and sometimes even their builds. And that's hugely important, because some mutators can completely change the value of a build. There are two categories of mutators you'll encounter during escalations. The first are global mutators, which affect the entire mission and every player participating in it. The second are enemy mutators, which affect specific enemies and can be identified by the icons displayed above their heads. Interpreting them won't be easy, as the game can also display other icons like status effects and seasonal modifiers, especially when enemies group together and icons start overlapping. Some mutators don't simply make enemies harder to kill, they force players to rethink how they position, how they move, how they support one another, and sometimes even what builds they bring into the mission. So let's take a look at some examples and see how these mutators can completely change the battlefield. Let's first look at the two global mutators and explore how to solve for them. The first is Unyielding. All enemies become immune to crowd control effects while significantly damaged. Now, if you've watched my Tactical Status Effects miniseries, you'll know that effects can be used to varying degrees to control enemy movement, deny territory, and create breathing room for your team. Unyielding changes that equation. It doesn't make status effects useless. They may not provide the crowd control or area denial you were relying on at the exact moment you need it most. And believe me, when a low-health suicider decides to sprint toward your position, that's a terrible time to discover that your crowd control isn't working. You can still use them, but choose strong tactics, teamwork, and positioning instead of relying on status effects to bail you out when things get desperate. The second global mutator is Hot Foot. If you stay in the same spot for too long, a charge counter begins to fill. When it reaches maximum, you are shocked and take damage. In a typical heroic mission, I'd push into a key position to lock down the battlefield, a method that had worked successfully many times before. But the Hot Foot mutator punished me for doing so. Every time the charge meter filled, I was forced out of position and exposed to enemy fire at exactly the wrong moment. And at Tier 5, where enemy damage is already 350% higher than heroic difficulty, that's not a minor inconvenience, that's a potentially lethal mistake. What normally felt like a strong defensive position suddenly became a liability. I wasn't just fighting the enemies anymore, I was fighting the battlefield itself. The key is to not snap to cover and stay there for too long. Use your surroundings to your advantage. Reposition frequently, give each team member their space, and avoid blocking each other's lines of fire. And engage from safer distances whenever possible. Not because you're afraid of the enemies, but because the game is actively teaching us that survival depends on movement, awareness, and adaptation. As you take on higher escalation tiers, the more likely enemies will have individual mutators. So consider their effects on the fight in conjunction with enemy armor, health, and damage scaling. Let's start down here and go upwards because I'm saving the best one for last. The aid specialist will repair his allies' armor if they are badly damaged. His icon is a polygon with 2 fists. The key here is to locate their healing stations at the centers of circles of green lights and eliminate them before they delete all the progress the DPS players in your group have made. The anchor has damage resistance and fires incendiaries as long as he has allies around him. His icon is a shape featuring a figure flanked by 2 others. His incendiary ammo will ignite you with the burn status effect, quickly eating through your armor and then health in a matter of seconds, while also preventing you from shooting or using skills effectively. If his teammates are still alive, he'll still have damage resistance against your DPS group members, making him a bullet sponge. You could take him out if you coordinate the group to focus fire at him. Or, you could try not to get hit and save him for the end, where his anchor mutator will wear out. Either way, be mindful of your teammates and surroundings, and stand loosely behind structures to block shots, but don't stay snapped to cover for too long. The suppressor is easy to spot by its icon, a seeker mine-like object that looks like it's about to explode. These enemies don't throw seeker mines, but when damaged, they start charging a powerful EMP. Here, you can see that the orange outer ring is nearly complete. Once it goes off, you'll kiss your skills goodbye. Have your DPS players burst them down quickly before the charge completes. To help counter the EMP, keep any skills you need out of EMP range, which is roughly 10 to 15 meters. If either skill gets hit, reposition and redeploy as soon as you can. And now I've saved the most important mutator for last, because this one gave our group a massively rude awakening. The Harvester mutator is identified by a scythe icon, similar to what you'd associate with the Grim Reaper. Its effect sounds simple enough on paper. When Harvester-powered enemies deal damage, they regenerate armor and health based on a percentage of your maximum armor. And to make matters worse, they can actually overheal beyond their normal armor and health limits. Now, when I first read that description, I understood it intellectually. What I didn't understand was just how dramatic the effect could be in an actual fight. We discovered that the hard way. On one escalation, one of our group had an all-blue core build. Now, in fairness, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting more survivability. In most activities, extra armor can help keep you alive longer, absorb mistakes, and give you more room to recover when things go sideways. But Harvester completely changed the equation. Every time Harvester enemies shot him, they regenerated their own armor and health based on his maximum armor value. And because he had invested so heavily into armor, those enemies were effectively feeding off him. At first, we couldn't understand what was happening. Up until that moment, we had been handling Tier 5 without any major issues. Then suddenly, enemies felt much harder to kill. Fights started dragging out. We were spending more ammunition, taking more damage, and losing control of engagements that normally would have been manageable. Meanwhile, the Harvester enemies kept regenerating, erasing much of the progress our DPS players were making. The irony was that when one of us went down, he was often the safest person to perform the revive. We were grateful he could survive. What we didn't realize at the time was that he had unintentionally become the team's kryptonite. The build solved one problem while creating a much bigger one. Looking back, the lesson became obvious. What works brilliantly in one game mode can become a liability in another. None of us fully understood what Harvester was doing at the time, but that experience taught us to pay much closer attention to how builds, mutators, and team composition interact with one another in Escalations. What I've come to appreciate about Escalations is that they're not simply another activity with bigger numbers and stronger enemies. The enemy scaling is intimidating enough on its own, but the real challenge comes from how all of these moving parts interact with one another. Builds interact with mutators. Mutators influence positioning. Positioning affects teamwork, and a small mistake in one area can quickly create problems somewhere else. The higher the tier, the less room there is for autopilot. You have to pay attention, you have to communicate, and you have to remain flexible when the battlefield throws something unexpected your way. If you're willing to do that, you'll not only improve your chances of success, but those beautiful purple prototype loot beams will also become much easier to earn. That's it from me. If this video helped you in any way, please consider subscribing and sharing it with friends who might benefit from it. I'd love to hear about your own escalation experiences down in the comments below. Always glad to have you here, Agent. Until the next video, stay strong, stay safe, and stay dangerous.